The truck slowed on the county road before it reached the mailbox. Then it stopped altogether. 40 acres of what should have been soybeans were gone. In their place, row after row of sunflowers stood in the pink half-light, their small green heads just beginning to lift toward a sun that had not yet cleared the tree line. Gold against a bruised sky, dust drifting sideways across the ditch. A woman knelt at the edge of the field, sleeves rolled to her elbows, dirt under her fingernails, a canvas notebook flat across her knee. She did not lift her head as the tires ground gravel behind her. Somewhere down the same road, a polished black SUV was already turning north. Boots that had never done a day of real work rested on the pedal. Inside a small back office, a manila folder sat in the third drawer of an oak file cabinet. Nobody had opened it yet. The pencil in the woman's hand kept moving. The first truck slowed on Route 9 before it reached the mailbox, then stopped altogether, the driver's boot easing off the gas as though the road itself had asked him to look twice. Morning fog still hung low over the ditches, drifting sideways in the pink half-light, catching on the barbed wire fence in soft, wet threads. He rolled his window down. He squinted. He leaned forward across the steering wheel until his cap brushed the windshield. 40 acres of what should have been soybeans. 40 acres of the same dark furrows this stretch of road had shown him every summer for as long as he could remember were gone. In their place stood row after row of sunflowers, still short, still gathering themselves toward whatever the season meant to make of them, their thin heads just beginning to lift toward a sun that had not yet fully cleared the tree line. At the edge of the field, a woman knelt with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, dirt work deep under her fingernails, a canvas notebook flat across her knee. She did not lift her head as the truck idled behind her. She did not turn when the tires ground gravel. She only kept writing the pencil, moving in short, careful strokes, the way a person writes who has decided long before this morning what the words are going to be. The driver leaned out his window. "Morning, Miss Hollenbeck. You mix up the seed bags this year, or is this the new fashion?" His voice carried the practiced ease of a man who had already told the joke twice before he ever made it to her fence. Clara Hollenbeck smiled without lifting her chin, the smile private, the smile of someone answering a question she had heard for weeks in slightly different clothes. Right seed, right field. He waited. He gave her the polite silence a farmer gives another farmer when he expects the rest of the sentence to arrive on its own. It did not arrive. He tipped his cap, put the truck in gear, drove on. By the time he pulled into the feed elevator lot, half an hour later, 3 men were already loading a trailer, and he told them what he had seen, and one of them laughed and one of them shook his head, and the third one only looked out toward the north road as if he could see 40 acres of yellow from where he stood. Before noon, the story had reached half the county, and by supper it had reached the rest, and none of it belonged to Claire anymore. The Hollenbeck farm rested on 210 acres of black Iowa loam that had grown corn and beans and small honest miracles for 3 generations without interruption. Clara's great-grandfather had cleared the first 40 acres by hand, working through summers so hot the horses had gone lame from the heat, working through winters so cold the axe head sometimes rang like a bell against the frozen wood. He had left the ground to his son, who had left it to his son, and now Walter Hollenbeck, at 65, walked those same fields with a bad knee and a stubborn back and a quiet certainty that the soil under his boots knew him better than most people ever would. Walter did not trust weather apps. He trusted the ache below his shoulder blade before a storm, the way starlings drop low across the pasture the afternoon before rain, the smell of the ground 3 days after a soaking. He had raised Clara among these things, the way another man might have raised a child among books. Clara had grown up walking those rows before she could reach the tops of the corn. She knew what the field sounded like when the combine ran clean, that low, steady hum you could feel in your sternum from across the yard. She knew the different hush that settled over the land the hour before a hard wind. At 18, she had left for the State Agricultural College 4 hours east, and she had come home 4 years later with a degree that most of her uncles could not have named if pressed. And she had done it quietly the way she did most things, taking the small bedroom at the back of the house without complaint, waking before dawn without being asked. Walter had let her take over 40 acres 2 years ago, as an experiment, mostly because he was tired of listening to her explain herself in language he could not fully follow, tired of nodding at phrases like soil biology and pollinator corridor and canopy retention. He was not a proud man. He was only a tired one. He believed a person had to be given room to test her own weight against the ground sooner or later, or she would carry the resentment of that untested strength for the rest of her life. When the spring seed order came through, Walter had noticed the invoice on the kitchen table beside his cold second cup of coffee. He had picked it up slowly. He had read it slowly. Sunflowers, he had said, setting the paper down the way a man sets down a plate he cannot decide whether to wash. The whole 40 acres. That's right. Sunflowers don't pay like beans do, Clara. She had not lifted her eyes from the ledger she was working through, the ends of her hair falling forward across her cheekbone. I know. He had waited for the rest of the sentence. He had grown used to waiting for the rest of her sentences over the past 2 years, the way a man grows used to waiting for weather. This one did not come. He had studied his daughter for a long moment across the table, and then he had folded the invoice with the same careful crease he used on tax papers, and he had walked out to his own fields without another word, because he had learned that pushing Clara never made her arrive any faster at the answer, and because a man his age was allowed the small mercy of not asking a question twice. But the county had never learned Walter's patience. By the second week, the sunflowers were up past a person's knee, and Marlene's Diner on Main Street had a new favorite subject, and every red booth by the front window had opinions to offer. 40 acres, Hank Sorensen was saying by Thursday of the third week, a man who had worked ground 2 miles east of the Hollenbeck place for 38 years and considered that experience a form of jurisdiction over anyone else's decisions. 40 acres of flowers. You believe that? Maybe she just likes the way they look, someone offered from the counter, half a smile in the voice. Heard she wanted the place to feel less like a factory this year. Something about how the eye needs a rest, or some fool line she picked up at that college. The booth laughed not cruelly, but with the kind of laughter that stings anyway when it reaches the person it is about. The laughter of people who have already decided they know the whole story and have moved on to enjoying it. By the following week, the joke had become settled fact around town. Walter Hollenbeck's girl had planted 40 acres of pretty flowers because she wanted the farm to look nice for once. Nobody asked her directly. In a small county, nobody ever did. They only assumed it, and then they moved on to the next topic, and the assumption sat behind them like a chair they had already agreed to leave in the corner. Clara heard about it the way a person always hears about these things in a small place. Secondhand, softened by whoever was kind enough to be the messenger. The sting arriving intact regardless. Her cousin Nora Whitcomb caught up with her at the Farm and Ranch Supply on a Tuesday afternoon, cornering her between the row of mineral tubs and the front counter, a look on her face that Clara had known since they were 7 years old. People are talking. Nora began arranging the words the way you arrange a difficult phone call. Aunt Peggy is telling anyone who will listen that you're going to lose the federal payment this year. She thinks you filed the acreage wrong. She's calling it a phase. Clara lifted a 50-pound bag of chicken feed onto her shoulder without breaking stride, walked it to her truck bed, dropped it with a soft, heavy thud. I'm not going to lose the payment. How do you know? Clara paused at the tailgate, then one hand still resting on the ridged metal, and she looked at her cousin the way a person looks at a photograph she has seen too many times to feel anything new about. Because I did the math before the seeds ever went in the ground. Then why won't you tell anybody the math? Because right now nobody would believe it. They'll believe the harvest. Nora did not push. She had known Clara long enough to know when a door had closed for the season. She only touched her cousin's elbow briefly, the kind of touch a woman gives another woman when she cannot yet decide whether she is offering comfort or asking for it. And she walked back to her own car with a slower step than she had arrived with, wondering whether Clara had lost her nerve for regular farming or found something the rest of them could not see yet. In the parking lot, she sat for a long minute before she turned the key. She thought about her cousin's face when the boys used to laugh at her in high school for taking notes in the truck cab during summer harvest. She thought about how Clara had never once cried in front of any of them, not when she got the college scholarship, not when she came home 2 years ago in a rented Buick with all her boxes in the back seat and no one waiting on the porch because Walter had been out fixing a broken fence line and had lost track of the hour. There was a version of her cousin Nora suspected that nobody in the family had ever quite met, and Nora was starting to suspect that version had been running the show for longer than anyone realized. What the county did not know, what none of them had thought to guess, was that Clara had not planted sunflowers on a whim. She had not chosen them because they were pretty. She had chosen them because 2 winters earlier, in the last semester of her final year, she had taken a small elective field course taught by a retired extension agent named Elias Thornbury, a soft-spoken man in his mid-70s who had spent 4 decades studying pollination patterns across the Midwest, before anyone outside academic buildings cared about the subject. Elias had thin white hair combed straight back off his forehead. He wore the same brown corduroy jacket to every class elbows worn through to the lining. He spoke slowly the way a man speaks who has learned that speaking too fast around farmers is the surest way to lose them. On the second week of that course, he had put a satellite map up on the projector dimmed. The fluorescence tapped the screen with a wooden pointer that looked older than most of the students. He had shown them yield comparisons across 130 Midwestern farms over a 9-year study, plotting fields that used deliberate pollinator strips against fields that did not controlled for weather, controlled for soil type, controlled for input costs. The difference was not small. The difference in some cases was staggering. Bees don't respect property lines, he had told them, his voice barely above the hum of the projector. If you give them a reason to stay close, they will do work for your neighbor's crop too. And if you are careful about it, if you are careful about where you plant and when you plant and what you plant, you can make sure a great deal of that work benefits you first. He had let the sentence hang. He had not repeated it. He had never repeated himself in that entire semester. And Clara had learned to write faster than she had ever written in her life to catch him. She had waited after class that day, standing at the edge of his desk, while the rest of the students filed out into the corridor, the smell of chalk and old radiator paint filling the small room. What is the best plant for that, she had asked him. For actually holding the pollinators, not just visiting them once and moving on. Elias had smiled the way he smiled at very few things. A slow, private smile. The smile of a man who had waited longer than he cared to admit for a student to ask that particular question. Sunflowers, long bloom window, reliable nectar reward. High enough biomass that bees build routine around them. Once a colony builds routine around a good stand of sunflowers, they don't stay confined to that one field. They will work every crop in a 2-mile radius that offers them anything at all. And they won't just work it, they will work it hard because they have a home base worth returning to. He had leaned back in his chair. It's not a gimmick, it's a strategy. But you have to be willing to be misunderstood for a full season at minimum. Most people can't stand that long. He had said no more that day. He did not need to. He had planted something in Clara that took 2 years to fully take root, and it had grown quietly, all the while the way most important things grow out of sight of the people who would later claim they had seen it coming. She had spent the 2 years since then reading soil reports late at night at the kitchen table after Walter had gone to bed. She had ordered bloom time charts from a small university press in Wisconsin. She had cross-referenced satellite yield studies until her eyes burned. She had walked the family fields on Sunday afternoons with a folded aerial photograph and a compass sketching where a sunflower buffer would have the most usable pollinator throw across the property line into the hybrid soybean acres. She had already begun quietly selecting for planting on the far side of the tree line. The plan was not to grow sunflowers. The plan was to grow something else better using the sunflowers as the engine that drove it. She had told no one. She had not told her father. She had not told Nora. She had not even told Elias himself, not exactly because she wanted the numbers to speak first before any name got attached to them. She had a suspicion that at some point in a person's life, the ground itself either backed up her judgment or did not, and she had decided at 29 that she was ready to hear the answer either way. The last Saturday of April, 3 days after the sunflower seed had gone into the ground, an unfamiliar SUV came up the long gravel drive of the Hollenbeck farm, moving too smoothly for a work vehicle, its dark polished paint catching the afternoon sun in a way no farm truck ever caught it. Clara was at the equipment shed swapping out the hydraulic filter on the older cultivator, her hands slick with fluid, a rag balled up in her hip pocket. She heard the tires on the gravel before she saw the vehicle, and she straightened slowly, wiping her hands, watching the SUV roll to a stop precisely in the center of the yard, where a person who lived on a farm would never think to park. A man stepped out. He was maybe 38, clean-shaven, a light gray suit jacket cut narrow at the waist, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. He wore boots that had been made to look worn without ever having done any actual work. He raised a hand in greeting, the way a man raises a hand when he already knows he is going to be received badly and has decided to smile through it anyway. Miss Hollenbeck. He crossed the yard with a walk that had been practiced. Wade Corbin. I represent Midwest Agri Holdings out of Des Moines. He offered a card. Clara did not take it. He set it politely on the workbench beside her instead, the way another man might set down a hat. I won't take much of your afternoon. I've been driving through this stretch of the county for about 3 months now, looking at properties that are underperforming their acreage potential, and your family's North 80 came up in our review. Beautiful ground. Truly beautiful ground. Some of the deepest topsoil in the county if the surveys are accurate. Clara wiped her hands again, more slowly this time. She did not answer. She had learned from her father that silence was often the cheapest and most powerful tool in any conversation, and she watched Wade Corbin adjust to it the way a man in a suit always eventually did. We've been prepared to make a very fair offer, he continued, one hand slipping the portfolio open on the workbench, a single printed page appearing on top with a number circled twice in blue ink. It's a straight cash purchase. No contingencies. 30-day close. Your father wouldn't have to sign a single loan document. He glanced up. And Miss Hollenbeck, I'll be direct, because I think you strike me as someone who appreciates directness. There are some concerning things happening on that acreage right now that our analysts have flagged. Sunflowers on prime bean ground. A crop with no visible market contract. I'm not here to tell you your business. I am here to tell you that when this season doesn't go the way you hope, and I say this respectfully, my company is going to be back out here with a lower number. Right now, the number's fair. In October, the number will not be fair. I would rather your family walked away whole. That's why I came in April instead of waiting. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Something behind her ribs went very quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives when a person recognizes an opponent for the first time and understands that the opponent has been studying her long before she noticed she was being studied. She let the silence stretch until Wade Corbin shifted his weight once, twice, until his easy smile began to look like it was requiring effort to maintain. Take your paper with you, Mr. Corbin, she said finally, her voice level. No heat in it. The number on that page tells me you already know what my ground is worth. It also tells me you're hoping I don't. She picked up his business card from the workbench, turned it once between her fingers, and slipped it into her hip pocket beside the rag. He watched her do it. Something changed in his face for the smallest fraction of a second, a small, tight recalibration behind the eyes, and then the professional smile returned. Fair enough, he said. I'll be in touch closer to fall. Please give my regards to your father. He walked back to the SUV without hurrying, folded himself into the driver's seat, back down the gravel drive, with the same practiced smoothness with which he had arrived. Clara stood at the workbench a long time after he was gone. She looked at the offer sheet he had left behind. She did not touch it. She looked at the number. She thought about the way he had said your father wouldn't have to sign a single loan document. She thought about the small, strange emphasis he had placed on that phrase, the way a man leans a fraction too hard on a word he thinks his listener has not caught the weight of. She folded the paper in half without reading the fine print, folded it in half again, slipped it into the back of her canvas notebook. She washed her hands slowly at the outdoor spigot. She walked back to the house. Walter was not home. He had gone into town for a bearing at the implement dealership, one of those errands that always took him twice as long as it should have, because he stopped to talk to every man he saw. Clara stood in the front room a moment, listening to the empty house tick around her, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the clock in the hallway carrying its slow, patient rhythm. Then she walked to the small back office her father had used for 40 years, a room she had not entered in months, a room he had always treated with a quiet privacy she had respected without ever being asked to. She needed the old plot map of the West Field, the one Walter kept in the third drawer of his oak file cabinet. She was going to overlay it with her pollinator range calculations that night at the kitchen table. She was thinking about nothing more complicated than that when she pulled the drawer open. The plot map was where it had always been top of the stack, its edges soft from decades of handling. Underneath it, in a manila folder that did not belong there, was a stack of paperwork she did not recognize. She lifted the map out. She meant to close the drawer. Instead, her hand stilled. The manila folder was labeled in her father's small, careful hand, the same hand she had watched write out grocery lists on the back of feed receipts her whole life. First Farmers Bank of Grange County. She looked at it a moment. She told herself it was a bill. She told herself it was a routine account statement. She told herself in the slow, reasonable voice a person uses when she has already begun to suspect she is lying to herself that it was none of her business anyway, and that closing the drawer was the right thing to do. She opened the folder. The top page was a mortgage agreement dated 14 months earlier, secured against the full 210 acres of the Hollenbeck farmhouse, included principal balance high enough that the number moved something under her breastbone before her mind had fully processed it. She turned the page. Amortization schedule. A single payment structure with a balloon due at the end of the current calendar year. She turned the page again. A crop insurance rider filed against expected soybean yields for the current season. Cross-referenced to a USDA acreage report, she had not known her father had submitted an acreage report that listed all 210 acres, including her 40, as intended commodity soybean production. She stood very still in the small back office. The clock in the hallway ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, far off across the pasture, a red-winged blackbird called once, and then went quiet. Clara turned another page, then another. She read every line. She read the origination date, and she read the loan officer's signature, and she read the small clause near the bottom of page 7 that specified what the bank could do if the borrower failed to plant harvest and market the crop as declared. She read the phrase material misrepresentation of intended use. She read the phrase acceleration of full principal balance. She read the balloon payment due date, December 1st. She looked at her father's careful signature on the last page, the small, careful hand that had written her name inside the cover of every birthday card of her entire life, and she understood in a way that arrived cold and complete all at once, that if she failed this season, if her 40 acres of sunflowers did not do what she had spent 2 years telling herself they would do, if the soybeans on the far side of the tree line did not perform the way her charts and her studies and her long, quiet nights at the kitchen table had convinced her they would, her father would lose the ground his grandfather had cleared by hand. She closed the folder. She put it back exactly where she had found it. She laid the plot map on top of it in the same position. She slid the drawer shut without a sound. She stood a long moment in the middle of the small back office, one hand resting lightly on the top of the file cabinet, breathing through her nose the way a person breathes when the body has decided independently of the mind that it is not yet allowed to make any noise. Then she walked out into the hall, past the ticking clock, past the humming refrigerator, out through the porch door, and down the porch steps, into the yard, where the late afternoon light was already beginning to lengthen across the drive. She did not go back into the house that evening. She walked instead across the yard, past the equipment shed, past the machine shop, along the fence line at the edge of the west pasture, out toward the north 80, where 40 acres of sunflower shoots were coming up in even quiet rows. Each one no higher than her ankle yet, each one holding its slender green promise in the softening light. She reached the edge of her field as the sun dropped behind the far tree line. She did not sit. She did not kneel. She stood at the border where the mowed grass ended and the soil began, and she looked out across the young stand, 40 acres of small pale green stretching to the horizon, and she thought about Elias Thornberry tapping the projector screen 2 winters ago and saying that a person had to be willing to be misunderstood for a full season at minimum. She thought about Wade Corbin's polished boots. She thought about the folder in the third drawer of her father's oak file cabinet and the small, careful hand that had signed her family's ground over to a bank in a town 20 miles away. She thought about the way her father had folded the seed invoice weeks earlier without a word and walked out to his own fields. And she understood now, standing at the edge of her sunflower rows in the falling light, that he had folded that invoice, knowing what was in the third drawer, knowing what depended on this year, knowing he had trusted her anyway, or knowing he had chosen to trust her anyway, which was not exactly the same thing, but which had cost him more than she had understood at the time. She crouched down at the edge of the field. She pressed her palm flat to the soil, the loam cool under her fingers, the small crumb texture of it, familiar the way a face is familiar. She did not speak. She did not pray. She was not a woman who reached easily for either. She only kept her hand on the ground a long moment until the sun was fully behind the trees and the sky above her had gone the deep bruised blue of the last minute before dark. And then she stood and she brushed the dirt from her palm against the seam of her jeans and she walked back toward the house. Halfway across the yard, she stopped. She looked up at the porch light already burning, her father moving slowly in the kitchen window with his back to her, running water into the sink, doing dishes with the same slow, patient method he did everything. She stood watching him a moment. She thought about walking in and telling him she knew. She thought about how his face would look if she did. She thought about the quiet man he had always been, and the quiet daughter he had raised, and the way both of them had spent their whole lives handing each other silence in place of the things they could not yet say out loud. Then she thought about the harvest still 5 months out, and the bank in Grange County, and the balloon payment due on the 1st of December, and the number Wade Corbin had circled in blue ink twice on a sheet of paper that was now folded in the back of her canvas notebook. She thought about the sunflowers behind her, still no higher than her ankle, still just beginning to lift their small green heads toward whatever the season meant to make of them. She would not tell him. Not yet. If she told him now, she would be telling him she was afraid, and she was not going to give him her fear along with everything else he was already carrying. She would carry it for both of them until she had something better to hand him. She had already been carrying more than anyone in the county knew for 2 years. She could carry this too. She walked up the porch steps. She opened the screen door quietly. Walter turned from the sink, a dish towel in his hands, the light from the kitchen fixture warm on the side of his face. "Long day," he said, more observation than question. Clara nodded once. She kept her voice level. "Went to check the North 80. Everything's coming up even." He watched her a moment, then he turned back to the sink. "Good," he said. "That's good." She hung her jacket on the peg by the door. She walked past him toward the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused her hand on the newel post, and she looked back once at the shape of her father's shoulders in the kitchen light. Then she went up the stairs to her room, and she closed the door behind her, and she sat down at the edge of her bed in the dark for a long moment before she reached out to turn on the lamp. She opened her canvas notebook. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote across the top in her own careful hand in letters small and precise, and unhurried the date. She wrote below the date in the same measured script the words she had not said out loud to anyone all day, that she was not going to say out loud to anyone for a very long time, that she was writing now, only so she could not later pretend she had not understood exactly what she was walking into. "If this fails, we lose everything." She looked at the sentence a long moment. She did not underline it. She did not circle it. She only sat with it there in front of her, on the page in her own hand, in her own small, careful letters, until she was ready to turn the page and begin working out the pollinator throw calculations she had come inside to do. Outside her bedroom window, the first stars had begun to appear over the North 80, and somewhere out there in the falling dark, 40 acres of young sunflowers stood in even, quiet rows against a sky she could no longer see, waiting for a season that would decide the rest of her life. She worked at her desk until nearly midnight. She sketched the property boundaries on graph paper from memory. She marked her 40 acres of sunflowers in one color, the 20 acres of hybrid soybeans she had planted on the far side of the tree line, in another, the prevailing summer wind direction in a third. She calculated pollinator flight distances from Elias's old lecture notes. She estimated bloom overlap windows using the almanac data she had pulled from the university press paper the previous winter. She did the math 3 separate ways because she had learned in college that a person who does not check her own math twice under pressure is a person who has already decided to fail. Each time the numbers came out the same. Each time the numbers said the plan should work. Each time she felt the small cold pressure return under her breastbone that reminded her that a plan working on paper and a plan working on the ground were not the same thing, and that the difference between the two had cost farmers their farms since long before her great-grandfather had first put an axe to timber on this property. At midnight, she closed the notebook. She turned off the lamp. She lay down on her narrow bed in her clothes without pulling back the quilt, and she stared at the ceiling in the dark, and she listened to the old house settling around her, the way old houses do, small ticks and small groans from the timbers, the sound of a place that had held a family for 100 years and did not yet know whether it would hold one for 100 more. She thought about her great-grandfather working through summers so hot the horses had gone lame from the heat. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about her father folding a seed invoice into a neat crease without a word. She thought about Elias Thornberry smiling that slow private smile in a small classroom 2 winters ago, saying that most people could not stand to be misunderstood for a full season. Most people can't stand that long. She turned her face toward the wall. She closed her eyes. Downstairs in the kitchen, Walter finished the dishes, dried his hands on the towel, hung the towel on the oven handle the way he had every night of his adult life. He stood a moment in the middle of the kitchen without moving. He looked toward the ceiling. He listened to the small, quiet sound of his daughter's footsteps overhead. Then the small, quiet sound of the lamp switching off. Then the deep, patient quiet of a house holding two people who loved each other and had never once in 29 years been able to tell each other so out loud. He walked to the third drawer of his oak file cabinet in the back office. He opened it. He looked at the plot map on top. He did not lift it. He knew what was underneath it. He closed the drawer slowly. He walked back to the kitchen. He turned out the light. He climbed the stairs to his own room at the end of the hall, and he lay down in the dark. And he stared at his own ceiling the way his daughter was staring at hers on the other side of the wall. And he thought about the balloon payment due on the 1st of December. And he thought about the daughter he had raised who was too much like him for either of their own good. And he thought about the invoice for sunflower seed he had folded in half without a word 2 weeks ago, because he had trusted her, and because he had decided that trust was the only thing he had left. He could still give her without her having to ask. Outside in the north, 40 acres of young sunflowers stood in the dark. The soil under them was still cool from the day. A small wind moved through the rows and moved on. Somewhere out at the tree line, a coyote called once and did not call again. The stars came fully out. The moon rose late, a thin curved sliver over the far field, and by the time it cleared the trees, the whole county had gone to bed. Convinced it already knew how the story ended, and the only two people who knew that it had not yet begun lay awake on either side of the same old wall, in the same old house, listening to the same old quiet, saying nothing. The drought did not announce itself. It arrived the way most disasters arrive in farm country, quietly. As a small change in the weather report, nobody paid attention to the first 3 days it appeared. By the middle of June, the county had gone 2 weeks without measurable rain. By the end of the third week, the ditches along Route 9 had cracked open in small pale lines like old skin, the topsoil in the shoulders lifting away in soft dust whenever a truck passed. The corn on the Sorensen place 2 miles east began curling its leaves inward by early afternoon, a defensive posture any farmer over the age of 40 could read from a moving vehicle. The forecast kept promising rain by Thursday. Thursday kept arriving without it. Clara walked her sunflower rows every evening now. She started at the west corner nearest the road at 7 o'clock. Notebook tucked under her arm, a small soil probe in her back pocket, a jug of water resting in the bed of her truck at the field edge for whatever thirst caught up with her before she finished. She measured moisture at 4 fixed points across the 40 acres, always the same points the way she had been taught in a soil hydrology lab she still had the notes from. The number slid downward every night by a fraction. Her young sunflowers were rooting deeper than she had expected for the variety reaching for water Elias had promised her they would find if they were given the right stress at the right time. But young was still young. A plant that had not yet closed its canopy could not conserve what it could not shade. She watched the small green heads begin to lift more slowly each morning, their color paling by degrees. She was not sure anyone but her would have noticed. On the 9th night without rain, her father found her out at the field with a flashlight, kneeling between 2 rows, digging a small, careful hole beside a taproot with a garden trowel to see how far down the moisture line had retreated. She heard the truck coming a quarter mile out. She did not stand. Walter parked at the edge of the drive, walked across the mowed strip in his boots without hurrying, stopped 4 feet from where she was working. His flashlight beam swept once across the row, then dropped politely to the ground beside her, the way a man's hand comes off another man's shoulder when he decides not to interrupt. "You're going to lose some of this if it doesn't rain soon." His voice was not cruel. It was the voice of a farmer speaking to another farmer, the way the honest ones always spoke to each other without cushioning. "I know." He waited. "A lot of paperwork riding on a flower crop with no contract on the books that I've seen." She sat back on her heels, wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, looked up at him for the first time in the beam of her own flashlight tilted toward the ground. "There's a contract, Dad. It just isn't the one you're thinking of. And I've got more riding on what comes after the flowers than on the flowers themselves." Walter did not answer at once. He looked out across the dark field. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he did when he was working out whether to press a question or let it lie. He decided to let it lie. "Well, I'll run the irrigation line down this direction tomorrow if you need it. The old aluminum pipe's still in the machine shed. Give me 2 afternoons." That was as close as he had come in her memory to saying he believed in what she was doing. He walked back toward his truck without waiting for a thank you, because he had never been a man who asked for one, and Clara watched his flashlight beam bob across the yard until it disappeared behind the equipment shed. She stayed in the row a long moment after he was gone. She pressed her palm to the small hole she had dug beside the taproot. The soil was warm under her hand from the day's heat. It was drier than she had wanted it to be. She filled the hole back in carefully with the trowel, tamped it with her knuckles stood, brushed the dirt from her jeans, walked the rest of the rows in the dark. The rain came 8 days later, in the way summer rain always arrives in that part of Iowa. All at once, without a proper warning, the sky going the color of an old bruise in the space of an hour. The wind rising suddenly out of the southwest, the first fat drops beginning to hit the metal roof of the machine shed with a sound like small stones. It was the kind of storm a farmer stands out on the porch to watch, hat in one hand, half a smile on his face because a storm this loud after a drought this long was the closest thing to a blessing the season would offer. It rained hard for 2 full hours. It rained the way ground that had been begging for water accepted it greedily, the small ditches running full before dark, the yard turning to a slick, shining film that reflected the porch light back up at itself. By the time the storm passed and the frogs started up in the low grass along the drive, Clara was standing at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee she had forgotten to drink, watching the last of the water sheet off the roof, feeling in her sternum, a small quiet loosening she had not permitted herself in 6 weeks. The next morning she walked her field at first light, boots sinking half an inch into the softened row middles, the smell of the wet loam rising around her legs, the sunflowers already visibly straighter than they had been at dusk the night before. She was halfway down the 3rd row when she stopped. She stood a long moment without moving. Then she walked forward 5 steps, 20 steps, 40. The damage began at the tree line and spread inward across almost 2 full acres of the northwest corner. Young sunflower heads bitten clean off at the stem. Whole rows of 6-inch stalks, flattened, split, trampled into the wet ground. Hoof prints pressed deep into the softened soil, dozens of them. Some of them the small, sharp tracks of yearlings. Some of them the wider, heavier prints of, does that had been leading their yearlings by the nose? The deer had come with the storm. The deer had always browsed the tree line along the north, 80 always kept to the edge. Always turned back from a bean field because a bean field held nothing for them. A field of tender young sunflower shoots, sweet and low and freshly stressed from the drought, had rung a bell in every white-tailed doe within a mile. And they had answered the bell in the dark while the storm covered the sound of them. Clara stood at the edge of the damage. Something tightened low in her chest. The small, hard tightening a person feels when the ground has decided to test whether her plan can survive its own success. This was the moment she would recognize later as the one she had been waiting for, without knowing it. The moment she would admit to herself much later when the shape of the whole year was clearer, was not doubt about the science, but doubt about her own stamina. Doubt about whether a woman who had spent 2 years reading soil reports at a kitchen table could actually endure a full season of the ground, pushing back against her one problem at a time. She did not call her father. She did not walk back to the house. She did not sit down at the edge of the field the way a person in a movie might have sat down. She walked back to the truck. She got in. She drove to the county hardware in town. She spent $47 on motion-activated sprinklers, 3 of them boxed. She spent another $20 on a roll of silver reflective tape, the width of her wrist, the kind Elias had mentioned in passing once during an office hour 2 winters ago, as a low-cost passive deterrent against browsing pressure. She loaded the boxes into her truck bed without asking anyone at the counter for help. She drove back out to the farm. She ate a cold sandwich standing at the kitchen counter. She went straight back out to the tree line in the afternoon heat, laid out the sprinkler placements against the aerial photograph. She kept folded in the truck's glove box, drove the ground rods with a hand sledge, ran the poly line off the outdoor spigot on the corner of the machine shed. She worked until the light left. She came inside at 9:15 with her jeans stiff with mud. Below the knee, her forearm scratched from the tape, drank a full glass of water at the sink. Went upstairs without a word to her father, who did not ask because he had learned by then not to ask on evenings when her mouth was set in that particular thin line. She was out at the tree line again the next evening, and the evening after that. Hank Sorensen drove past the farm on the second evening on his way back from a hay auction over in Grange County, and he slowed his truck at the sight of her working. He rolled his window down. He did not smile. He watched her for a moment through the open window, a woman on her knees in the wet grass at the edge of a tree line, adjusting the spray radius on a small plastic sprinkler she had staked into the ground with a hand-driven rod. Heard about the deer damage. Tough break. Clara did not look up from her work. It's manageable. Hank watched her a moment longer. He had come here expecting to see a woman defeated. She was not defeated. She was on her knees at dusk, fixing what could still be fixed in the way people around here had always fixed, what could still be fixed without ceremony. And Hank Sorensen, who had spent the better part of 2 months in Marlene's diner making sport of what she was doing, felt something small and uncomfortable turn over in the back of his throat. My grandfather used to say the ones who keep working after a setback are usually the ones who end up right. His voice came out quieter than he had meant it to. Doesn't mean I understand what you're doing out here. I'll say that much anyway. Clara looked up then for the first time. She did not smile. She did not thank him. She only met his eyes across the tree line, and she gave him a small single nod, and she went back to her sprinkler. Hank Sorensen sat in his idling truck for another few seconds. Then he rolled the window up. Then he drove on. He did not tell anyone at the diner what he had seen that evening. He did not have language yet for the size of the small crack that had opened in his own certainty, and he was old enough to know that a man who did not have language for something was better off not speaking about it until he did. The letter came on the following Wednesday. Clara found it in the mailbox at the end of the drive on her way in from the field at 6:30 in the evening, a plain white business envelope with the return address of First Farmers Bank of Grange County printed neatly in the upper left corner. She stood at the mailbox with the envelope in her hand a long moment before she opened it, the wind moving across the drying tops of the sunflowers behind her, the sound of a cicada rising and falling somewhere in the shelter belt. She walked halfway down the drive before she slit the top of the envelope with her thumbnail. She stopped at the edge of the culvert to read the letter. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. It was signed by a loan officer named Marlene Voss, whose name Clara did not know. The first paragraph informed her in the small, careful language banks use when they have already made their decision that a routine acreage compliance review had flagged an inconsistency between the crop declared on the mortgage collateral rider filed the previous fall and the crop currently in the ground at the north 80 of the Hollenbeck property. The second paragraph in the same careful language informed her that the bank considered this a possible material misrepresentation of intended use, and that under the acceleration clause of the mortgage, the borrower was hereby required to make full payment of the outstanding principal balance within 60 days of the date on the letter failing, which the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings against the collateral. The date on the letter was the previous Monday. 60 days from the previous Monday landed within a week of the end of harvest. The letter closed with a polite line inviting the borrower to contact the loan officer directly at his or her earliest convenience. Clara read the letter twice. She folded it back into its envelope with the same care Walter had used to fold the seed invoice in April. She slipped the envelope into her back pocket. She walked the rest of the way up the drive at the same steady pace she had been walking all summer, because she had learned by now that a woman who let the length of her stride be changed by bad news was a woman who had already begun to hand the news the power to make her decisions for her. Walter was at the kitchen table when she came in, a plate of cold chicken in front of him, a paperback novel open beside the plate, the way he read at supper on evenings when he had eaten alone. He looked up. "Mail. Bills," she said. She did not stop at the table. She hung her jacket on the peg, walked past him, toward the stairs, climbed to her room. She closed the door. She sat down at the edge of her bed with the envelope in her hand. She looked at the return address a long moment. She thought about Wade Corbin standing in the yard in April, saying with that small, deliberate emphasis, "Your father wouldn't have to sign a single loan document." She thought about the polished boots that had never done a day of real work. She thought about the way he had watched her slip his business card into her hip pocket, the small, tight recalibration behind his eyes. She thought about how a loan officer at a small county bank did not run acreage compliance reviews against sunflower crops on private property in the middle of June for no reason. Someone had made a phone call. Someone had suggested to someone else that a particular file might be worth looking at. Someone had known which lever to pull and which small bureaucratic mechanism would move if the lever was pulled at the right time, and Clara did not need to guess who. She did not tell her father. She could not tell her father. Telling him would be handing him a weight he had already carried alone for 14 months, doubled now by the knowledge that his daughter had opened the third drawer of his oak file cabinet in April and had chosen not to say so. She would carry the letter herself. She would drive to the bank in Grange County in the morning. She would sit across a desk from Marlene Voss with the letter folded on her knee. She would find out how much of the pressure was procedure and how much of it had been arranged, and she would say nothing to Walter until she had something better than fear to hand him. She drove into Grange County on a Thursday morning. The bank was a low brick building on the corner of Main and 3rd, the same building it had been since the 1950s. A metal deposit box mounted beside the double glass doors, a row of American flags along the sidewalk out front. Marlene Voss was a thin woman in her early 40s with prematurely gray hair pulled tight behind her ears in a tidy corner office with a window that looked out on the drive-through lane. She stood when Clara came in. She offered coffee. Clara declined. Marlene closed the door. She sat down behind the desk. "Miss Hollenbeck, I appreciate you coming in on short notice." Her voice was practiced, unemotional, the voice of a woman who had delivered bad news for a living for the better part of 2 decades. "I understand this letter came as a surprise." Clara set the envelope on the desk between them. It came as a surprise. It did not come as a coincidence. Marlene's face did not change. "I'm not sure I follow." Clara let the silence sit for the length of one long breath, then two. She had learned from her father on 100 fence lines and in 100 small negotiations that a silence in a room like this was a scale, and that the person who did not fill it first was the person the scale would eventually tilt toward. Marlene tilted first. "It's a routine compliance review, Ms. Hollenbeck. Any change to declared crop use triggers a file review. The bank has an obligation to protect the collateral." Clara reached across the desk. She did not raise her voice. "Did you receive a phone call about this file before the review was triggered?" Marlene's mouth pressed thin. "I'm not in a position to discuss internal procedures. Then we understand each other." Clara stood. She did not reach for the letter. She left the envelope on the desk between them, a small, deliberate object placed there like a marker. "I'll meet the payment. I'll meet it in full. I'll meet it by the deadline in the letter. If you would prefer to withdraw the acceleration and treat this as a routine variance, I can file an amended acreage report for the current season, and we can settle this quietly. If you would prefer to proceed, we can proceed. I would like you to be sure which one you prefer before I walk out of this office, because I will not be back to renegotiate." Marlene looked at her a long moment. There was something in the woman's face Clara could not entirely read, a professional stillness with a small fracture behind it. The fracture a person develops when she has been asked more than once over the course of a career to do things she was not proud of. The acceleration stands, but I'll note in the file that the borrower has confirmed intent to meet the deadline in full. "Then we understand each other," Clara said again, and she walked out of the office, and she did not look back once as she crossed the lobby to the double glass doors, and she did not permit her hands to shake until she was inside the cab of her own truck with the door closed behind her. She drove home the long way. She took the county road through the low bottomland north of the river, past a stand of cottonwoods she had not driven past since she was a teenager, past a small white church at the intersection of 2 gravel roads, whose bell she had heard ringing across the fields on every clear Sunday morning of her childhood. She let herself cry once briefly, without pulling the truck over the tears coming and going in the space of maybe 40 seconds, unaccompanied by any sound, the way a person cries who has decided that the crying is a debt she is paying quickly so she can go back to work. Then she wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She drove home. She did not tell her father where she had been. Silas Boone called her at 9:40 the next night. Clara was at the kitchen table with her notebook open, cross-referencing bloom stage, counts from her most recent field walk against the pollinator activity log Silas had been sharing with her every 3rd day when the wall phone rang. She answered on the second ring. His voice was not right. Silas was a big man, 62 years old, a beekeeper who had run 12 hives in the county since before Clara was born, a man whose voice on the phone had always been the low, easy voice of a man who did not startle. Tonight it was tight. "Clara, somebody came out to the property this evening." Clara set her pencil down. "What did they say?" "He said he was from an insurance liaison office out of Des Moines. Said my policy carrier had flagged a concern about hive placements on ground that was under, and I'm quoting him here, active USDA investigation for undeclared crop chemistry. Said if the hives were still at the Hollenbeck property when a claim was ever filed, my carrier would not pay out on colony loss. Said it as a favor. Said it like he was doing me a kindness." Clara closed her eyes. She let her forehead rest against her free hand for the space of 2 heartbeats. What did he look like? Silas paused. He described Wade Corbin without knowing he was describing Wade Corbin, without knowing the description mattered. Silas cleared his throat. I don't know what's happening out there, Clara. I don't want to know. But I have 12 hives on your ground, and my livelihood is those hives, and I've got a wife and two grandkids I bring honey money home to. Clara did not answer at once. She was already moving, already reaching for her jacket on the back of the chair, already sliding her feet into her boots by the door. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Silas. I need you to wait for me. Don't move the hives yet. Just wait for me. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then quietly, all right, 20 minutes, I'll wait. She drove to Silas's place with a canvas satchel on the passenger seat beside her. The satchel containing 2 years of soil test reports, the current season's herbicide-free management plan, the USDA organic certification paperwork she had begun, though not yet completed on the 20-acre soybean field across the tree line, and every field logbook she had filled since April. She pulled into his yard at 10 minutes past 10. He was on the porch with the light on a coffee mug in his hand, his big shoulders rounded forward the way a man's shoulders round forward when he has been sitting with a hard decision for the better part of an hour. She climbed the porch steps. She sat down beside him on the top step without asking. She opened the satchel across her lap. Silas, I need you to look at these with me. I need you to look at them tonight. I need you to see for yourself that there is no undeclared crop chemistry on my ground, that there is no USDA investigation of any kind, that the man who came to see you today was working for a company in Des Moines that has been trying to force my family to sell our farm since April. He is telling you a story because he cannot get his story to work any other way. He knows if he can move your bees off my property before the middle of August, he can break what I've spent 2 years building. Silas looked at her. His face in the porch light was tired. He looked at the papers in her lap. He looked back at her face. He was quiet a long moment. I don't need you to trust me forever, Silas. She kept her voice level. She did not touch his arm. She did not lean toward him. I need you to trust me for 6 more weeks. If at the end of 6 weeks you decide I'm not worth the risk, you move your hives, and I will help you move them myself, and I will not hold it against you a single day. But if you move them tomorrow morning, we both know what happens. He looked at her a long moment more. Something in his big shoulders eased by a small measurable degree. All right, 6 weeks. She let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding. She began slowly to walk him through the papers. She drove home a little after 1 in the morning. She parked the truck under the yard light, killed the engine, sat a moment in the dark with her hand still on the wheel. She thought about Marlene Voss's face across the desk in Grange County. She thought about the small, deliberate way Wade Corbin had walked across the yard in April, the polished boots, the practiced smile. She thought about the phone call to the bank he had almost certainly made, and the phone call to Silas Boone's insurance liaison he had almost certainly arranged, and the small ways a man in a light gray suit could pull 100 quiet levers from 100 miles away and never leave a fingerprint anywhere Clara could show to anyone who had not already decided to believe her. She got out of the truck. She walked to the house. She let herself in through the porch door as quietly as she could, took off her boots at the mat, walked upstairs in her socks so she would not wake her father. She did not turn on the hall light. At the top of the stairs, she paused. Walter's door was closed. She stood a moment listening for his breathing. She heard nothing at all. She went to her own room. She did not sleep. Nora Whitcomb pulled into the yard the following afternoon at 3:20, her small blue hatchback kicking up a small trail of dust down the gravel drive. Clara was at the machine shed, sharpening a hoe blade with a hand file. Her forearms already dusted with fine metal shavings, the mid-afternoon sun high enough to press heat down through the roofing panels overhead. Nora did not close the car door behind her all the way. She crossed the yard at a walk that was almost a jog. Clara straightened. Nora's face was flushed half from the heat, half from something Clara did not yet have language for. Clara. Nora's voice was low, not because there was anyone to overhear them, but because a person lowers her voice on instinct when the news she carries feels heavier than the voice can politely bear. I was in the diner. Just now, Buck Sorensen's boy was in there. Wade Sorensen. He was talking to a man in a suit at the corner booth. I didn't hear all of it. I heard enough. Clara set the file down on the workbench slowly. What did you hear, Nora? Nora's voice caught. I heard your dad's name. I heard the words, "We've got a meeting at 10 in the morning. I heard the suit tell him the number he was authorized to offer would not stay on the table past next week. Clara's chest did not tighten. It went the opposite way. It emptied all at once, the small, hollowing feeling that a person feels when the room falls out from under her in a single silent motion. Nora reached for her elbow. Clara did not move. Clara, your dad has a meeting with them tomorrow. He hasn't told you. He hasn't told anybody. Somebody in the diner heard him on the phone with them yesterday. It's been going around since lunch. Clara looked at her cousin. She kept her voice level because the voice was the last thing she still had control over. Where is the meeting, Nora? Nora shook her head. I don't know exactly. Somewhere off Route 9. Buck's boy said they'd meet him halfway, whatever that means. 10 in the morning, that's all I know. Clara nodded once. She thanked her cousin. She sent her cousin home. She stood a long moment at the workbench after Nora's car had disappeared down the drive, the file still in her hand, the sun still pressing down through the roofing panels. And she thought about her father, 65 years old, with a bad knee and a stubborn back, sitting alone in his own kitchen, deciding to save her from a burden she had not asked him to save her from, planning to sell the ground his grandfather had cleared by hand, rather than let his daughter be the one who lost it. She had never in her life been more furious with him. She had never in her life loved him more. She did not sleep that night either. She lay in the dark and she watched the small square of ceiling above her bed slowly lighten toward gray, and she rehearsed sentences in her head, and she rejected sentences in her head, and she settled at last somewhere around 4 in the morning on the only sentence she was going to allow herself to use because it was the only sentence that was going to be true. At 6:15, she was already dressed. At 6:30, she was in the truck. She did not stop for coffee. She did not eat. She drove to Route 9 and she parked half a mile short of the intersection where Wade Corbin had once told her in her own machine shed in April that he would rather her family walked away whole. She did not know where the meeting was. She knew her father drove Route 9 in the morning the way he had driven it every morning of his adult life, north to Grange County or east to town. And she knew that whichever way he was going that morning, he would come past this stretch of road, because Route 9 was the only way out of the county from the Hollenbeck property, and because she had been born on this road, and she knew the way it moved through a person's life. She waited. She waited nearly 2 hours. At 9:15, she saw the familiar shape of her father's old red Chevrolet Crest, the small rise a mile south of her, moving at his steady, careful speed, the same speed he drove in every weather, in every season. She started her own truck. She pulled out into the middle of the road. She stopped crosswise, her tailgate to one shoulder, her hood to the other, the truck blocking both lanes. She got out. She walked to the middle of the road. She stood there. Walter Chevrolet slowed. It came to a stop 30 yards from her front bumper. He did not honk. He rolled down his window. His face through the windshield looked older than it had looked at the kitchen table the night before. He got out slowly. He walked toward her without shutting his door. He stopped when he was still 5 feet from her, his hands at his sides, his eyes on her face. Clara. He did not raise his voice. He never had. What are you doing? Clara's voice did not shake at first. I know about the bank, Dad. I know about the 14 months. I know about the balloon due December 1st. I know Wade Corbin came to the house in April. I know he called the bank. I know he sent a man to Silas Boone's house on Wednesday night. I know you have a meeting at 10 in the morning. I know why. She took one step forward. Her voice broke once in the middle of the next sentence, the first time in 29 years she had let it break in front of him. I know you were going to sell the ground your grandfather cleared to save me from losing it. Walter's shoulders moved. Not much. A small shift of the rib cage, the smallest possible motion a man's body can make when a sentence has hit him directly under the sternum. He did not look away. He did not deny anything. He did not lie. He only stood in the middle of the road at 9:15 in the morning and looked at his daughter, and after a long moment his mouth opened and no sound came out, and it closed again. Give me 6 weeks, Dad. Her voice steadied. She held his eyes across the 5 feet between them. I have known about the bank since April. I have known about Wade Corbin since April. I have not slept a full night in 6 weeks. I have something in the works I have not told you about because I did not want you to carry it if it didn't come through. It is coming through. I need 6 weeks. If in 6 weeks I have not made the payment in full, you can sell whatever you need to sell, and I will not fight you, and I will help you pack every box myself. But I need 6 weeks. She did not say please, she did not need to. Walter looked at his daughter for a long moment more. The wind moved once across the tops of the corn in the field behind him. Somewhere far off, a red-winged blackbird called. He nodded. Once. He turned. He walked back to his truck. He got in. He backed the old red Chevrolet slowly onto the shoulder, made a careful three-point turn, drove back the way he had come, north toward the farm without ever looking at her again. Clara stood in the middle of Route 9 a long moment after he had disappeared over the rise. Then she walked back to her own truck. She got in. She drove home. Her father was not at the house when she got there. His truck was not in the yard. She did not know where he had gone. She did not go looking for him. She walked into the kitchen. She washed her hands at the sink. She poured herself a glass of water. She drank it standing at the counter, looking out the window at the drive, at the empty space where his truck was not. Then she walked to the small back office. She opened the third drawer of the oak file cabinet. She lifted out the plot map. She lifted out the manila folder underneath. She carried both of them back to the kitchen table. She sat down. She laid them side by side on the surface in front of her. She reached into her canvas satchel on the chair beside her. She took out the folded offer sheet Wade Corbin had left on her workbench in April, the number circled twice in blue ink. She laid it beside the mortgage folder. She took out the letter from Marlene Voss. She laid it beside the offer sheet. 3 pieces of paper on the kitchen table in a neat, unhurried row, the row of a woman who had spent her whole life putting things where they belonged. She looked at the 3 pieces of paper a long moment. Then she reached again into the satchel and she drew out a 4th folder she had been keeping in the bottom of the satchel since the middle of March. A folder no one in the county knew. She had a folder that contained a signed and countersigned contract with a small organic pressing cooperative outside a town in southern Minnesota, dated the 21st of March, a contract she had negotiated over the winter by long telephone calls, and one drive north on a Sunday in February when she had told her father she was going to a farm equipment auction. She laid the 4th folder beside the other 3 papers. She sat with the 4 documents on the kitchen table for a long time. The clock in the hallway ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, somewhere in the middle distance, a single sparrow was working the eave under the porch roof. Clara did not move. She looked at the 4 papers the way a person looks at a hand of cards she has been holding for 6 months without letting herself count. Then she leaned forward. She opened the 4th folder. She read the top page, though she already knew every word on it by heart. She checked the delivery date. She checked the price per hundredweight. She checked the volume commitment. She checked the small clause on page 3 that specified in the small, careful language cooperatives used when they were writing contracts they did not want to have to litigate that the crop would be classified for pricing and regulatory purposes as a canopy pollinator crop under a specific USDA program subsection whose full number she could have recited in her sleep. She closed the 4th folder. She placed her hand flat on top of it. She held her hand there a long moment. Then she stood. She carried the 4 documents together to the small locked cabinet at the top of the pantry, the one Walter did not know she used, the one where she had been keeping her most important paperwork for 8 months. She placed the folders inside. She turned the small brass key. She put the key in her pocket. She walked back into the kitchen. She started making supper for her father because he was going to come home tonight, and he was going to sit down at the table across from her, and neither of them was going to say a single word about Route 9, and both of them were going to eat, and she was going to make sure the food on his plate was hot. Silas Boone called Clara before sunrise on the 2nd Tuesday of August. She was already awake. She had not slept properly in 9 days since the morning she had stood in the middle of Route 9 in front of her father's truck, and the nights had been running one into the next without proper edges between them, filled with paperwork she reread until the words stopped meaning what they meant, filled with bloom count logs. She checked against the previous week's logs, the way a person checks the pulse of someone she loves. The phone rang at 4 minutes past 5 in the morning. Silas's voice on the other end of the line was not tight this time. It was quiet. It was the kind of quiet a big man arrives at when he has been standing in a field before dawn, watching something he does not have words for yet. Clara, you need to come out here. His breath came slow in the receiver. You need to come out to the north edge of the field. You need to come now. She did not ask what for. She pulled on her boots at the door in the dark. She grabbed the canvas jacket off the peg. She drove out to the North 80 with the truck windows down, the pre-dawn air cool through the cab, the sky over the tree line, the color of a bruised plum going pale at the edges. She parked at the fence line. She walked the last 100 yards through the mowed strip on foot. Silas was standing at the corner post where the tree line met the open field. He did not turn when she came up behind him. He only raised one big hand and pointed. Clara stopped beside him. She followed the line of his arm across the sunflower rows. The sound reached her before the sight resolved a low, deep vibration that was not a sound so much as a presence. A felt hum along the sternum. The kind of hum a person feels when she is standing near a high-tension line without having realized it. The sun was still 6 minutes from clearing the horizon. The light was that particular blue-gray that lasts only about 11 minutes each morning in the middle of August, the light that makes yellow look like it is coming from inside the plant rather than off the surface of the petal. Clara looked out across her 40 acres of sunflowers, and the whole field was moving. Not the plants, the air above them. The first 10 feet of air above every row was alive with motion, thousands upon thousands of bees, so many that the shape of the swarm gave the field a second surface, a shimmering layer above the yellow that shifted with the breeze, the way heat shifts above summer pavement. Not one hive of bees. Not two. Silas had brought his 12. The other keepers in the county, 4 of them by Clara's count, had brought theirs unasked, drawn to the field by the same instinct a river follows when it finds a lower channel. The bees moved in a slow, deep pattern across the rows, working every open bloom at a density Clara had read about in journals during her college years, but had never truly expected to witness on ground her own hands had prepared. Silas beside her cleared his throat once. He did not look at her. In 41 years of working bees in this county, I have never once seen a field pull traffic like this. Not once, he paused. Not close. His voice caught briefly on the last word. Clara stood a long moment without moving. She let the vibrations settle into her chest. She felt something inside her that she had been holding tight for 4 months begin to unclench by a small measurable degree, though she did not let herself trust the feeling yet, because she had learned by now that a woman who trusted good news before harvest was a woman who had already begun to negotiate with the ground. Whatever you built here, Silas, it's working. It's your bees. It's their work. She shook her head once. It's your patience with me. He turned his head toward her then. He looked at her a long moment in the blue-gray light. Then he looked back out at the field. They stood together at the corner post another full minute without either of them speaking, and the sound of 10,000 wings moving together over 40 acres of yellow filled the space where the words would have been. She walked her father across the tree line that same afternoon. She did not tell him where they were going. She only came in from the field at 2:30, walked into the kitchen where Walter was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him, and yesterday's register spread open to the livestock report. He had not been reading, laid her canvas notebook on the table between them, and told him she needed him to come see something. He looked at her. He did not ask. He stood. He put on his cap. He followed her out to the truck. They drove in silence to the 20-acre plot on the far side of the shelter belt, the ground he had never once walked with her since April, the ground he had watched from a distance and had chosen not to interfere with. She parked at the field edge. She got out. She walked into the middle of the 3rd row of hybrid soybeans. She stopped. She waited for him to catch up. Walter walked into the row behind her. He did not speak. He looked at the canopy at his knees. He looked at the row spacing. He reached down without asking her permission, without announcing what he was doing in the way a farmer reaches for a plant on his own ground when he has been reading crops for 50 years and does not need to explain the reading to anyone. He selected a pod at random from a plant 3 rows in. He turned it over between his thumb and forefinger the way he had turned over 10,000 pods across his working life. He pressed his thumbnail against the seam. He split the pod open. He looked at the beans inside. He stood a long moment without moving. Then he selected another pod from a different plant farther down the row. He split that one too. He stood again. He selected a 3rd pod from a 3rd plant at the far end of the row, and by then Clara understood what he was doing. The private, slow method of a man cross-checking his own eyes against the possibility that he was seeing what he wanted to see rather than what was there. He came back down the row toward her, the 3 split pods cupped in his palm. He held his palm out to her flat the way a person holds out something small and living. Clara. His voice came out lower than she was used to hearing it. His voice came out the voice of a farmer, not of a father. I have been doing this since I was 8 years old. I have never seen pod fill like this on this ground. Not in 1982. Not in the wet spring of '99. Not in the best year I have ever had. He looked up from his palm to her face. What did you do? Clara took the pods from his hand. She closed her fingers around them gently. She sat down cross-legged on the dry ground in the middle of the row. She patted the soil beside her. Sit down, Dad. It's time. He sat. He set his cap on his knee. He waited. She opened her canvas notebook. She turned to the section she had been building for 2 years. The section she had never opened for anyone. The section that began with a hand-drawn map of the property in her own careful pencil, and moved forward from there, through soil moisture, logs, pollinator, flight distance, calculations, bloom time overlap, charts pulled from a small university press paper on desk. Mimeographed pages yield comparison studies from a 9-year field trial in southern Wisconsin. She walked him through it slowly. She did not skip ahead. She did not summarize. She read him her margin notes from January of the previous year. She showed him the sketches of the pollinator throw from the sunflower field into the soybean acres across the tree line, the small arrows she had drawn in pencil to indicate wind vector under a prevailing summer southwest. She showed him her count logs from 3 mornings a week all summer, the tally marks accumulating in careful groups of 5 across the columns. She showed him her projected yield comparisons against last year's numbers on the same 20 acres. She let him ask questions. She answered every one. He listened without interrupting for the better part of an hour. He turned the pages of the notebook himself slowly with the same care he used on tax papers. When she reached the final page and closed the cover, he did not speak for a long moment. He looked out across the 20-acre field. He looked at the tree line behind them, at the faint drift of bees still working the far edge of the sunflower rows a quarter-mile off. He set his hand flat on the ground beside him, palm down, the way a man sets his hand down when he has decided something. You carried this whole thing yourself. 2 years. She did not answer. She only looked at him. His voice was quieter still. I could have helped. I know. That was not why. His mouth worked once. Why? Because I needed to know it would work before I asked you to believe it would. I needed to be able to hand you a result, not a hope. Walter looked at his daughter a long moment. Then he did something she had not seen him do since she was 11 years old, since the year her mother had died, and neither of them had known how to speak to each other for 3 months afterward. He reached over. He put his hand over hers where it rested on the closed cover of the canvas notebook. He did not squeeze. He only left his hand there, the weight of it steady and dry and warm, and he kept it there for the length of 1 long breath, then 2. Then he took his hand back. He picked up his cap from his knee. He stood. He offered her his other hand to help her up. She took it. They walked back to the truck together in silence across the row. Halfway to the fence, he stopped. He looked at her sidelong. I don't know if I can promise I would have trusted this in April, Clara. I don't know if I can promise I would have trusted it in June. I want you to know I trust it now. She nodded once. That was enough. That was all she had wanted. They drove back to the house without further conversation. He did not ask about the bank. She did not offer. Both of them understood that the bank was the next thing, and that the next thing was hers to solve, and that his part in the solving was to trust her long enough for her to finish. Marlene Voss called the following Monday morning at 9:30. Her voice on the phone was cooler than it had been in the office 3 weeks earlier. Professional in the specific way voices go cool when the person speaking is no longer speaking only for herself. Miss Hollenbeck, I wanted to give you the courtesy of a heads up. The bank's outside counsel will be accompanying me to your property tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. We will need to conduct an on-site inspection of the crop under the terms of the acceleration clause. It is a routine step. It does not preclude a settlement. Clara did not hesitate. 2 o'clock is fine. Bring whoever you need. There will be a chair for each of you at the kitchen table. Clara set the receiver back in the cradle. She stood a long moment beside the wall phone in the hallway. Then she walked into the kitchen. Walter was at the table with the ledger open in front of him, working through the seed cost columns from the previous spring the way he did most Monday mornings. He looked up. She stood in the doorway a moment. "Bank's coming tomorrow at 2. On-site inspection." He nodded slowly. "Anything you need me to do?" She looked at him a long moment. "Yes. I need you to sit at the table with me. I don't need you to say anything. I need them to see you sitting there." He closed the ledger. "All right." She spent Monday afternoon at the pantry cabinet. She unlocked the small brass lock. She lifted out the 4 folders she had placed there the night after Route 9 days earlier. She carried them to the kitchen table. She spread them out. She reorganized them. She built a 5th folder that combined the most important pages of the other 4 into a single sequence, arranged in the order a lawyer would want to read them indexed by hand, with small numbered tabs cut from an old manila envelope. She checked every date. She checked every signature. She checked the crop classification clause on page 3 of the Minnesota Cooperative Contract for the 7th time in a week, running her finger along the small paragraph that specified in the small, careful language cooperatives use when they have been through USDA compliance audits before the exact subsection under which the crop would be classified for pricing and regulatory purposes. The subsection number matched. It had matched every time she had checked it since March. She closed the folder. She placed it at the center of the kitchen table. She left it there overnight. The next afternoon at 7 minutes past 2, a dark sedan pulled into the yard. Marlene Voss stepped out of the driver's side in a navy jacket and low black heels. She had clearly chosen for the drive rather than the walk to the porch. A second man got out of the passenger side, older mid-60s, a soft brown leather briefcase in his left hand, the kind of small, carefully knotted tie that told Clara immediately the man had been practicing agricultural finance law long enough to have written some of the boilerplate himself. Walter met them at the porch step. He shook their hands without smiling. He walked them into the kitchen. Clara was already at the table. She stood when they came in. She offered them each a chair. She did not offer coffee. Marlene sat. The lawyer sat beside her. Walter took the chair at Clara's right. Clara sat down last. She placed her hands flat on either side of the 5th folder, which sat on the table between her and Marlene like a small closed door. Marlene opened her own portfolio. She began the way she had been trained to begin. "Miss Hollenbeck, under the terms of the acceleration clause we discussed in my office on the 27th, the bank is required to physically inspect the collateral prior to the maturity date of the demand. I have Mr. Hoffner with me today to observe and to document. This is a formality. If the crop currently in the ground on the mortgaged acreage is not in substantial compliance with the acreage declaration filed against the loan, the bank will proceed with foreclosure, as noted in the letter of the 27th. If the crop is in substantial compliance, or if the borrower is prepared to demonstrate an equivalent revenue path that satisfies the collateral clause under the material use provisions of paragraph 7, we can discuss adjustments." Clara looked at her a long moment. Then she opened the 5th folder. She slid it across the table. "Take a look at the top page first." Marlene lifted the top page. It was the signed and countersigned contract with the small organic pressing cooperative outside of town in southern Minnesota, dated the 21st of March, the same paper Clara had drawn out of her satchel at the kitchen table 9 days earlier, under her own private inspection. Marlene read the first page. She turned to the second. She turned to the third. Her eyes stopped near the middle of the 3rd page. Clara watched her eyes stop. Clara knew which paragraph her eyes had stopped on. Marlene did not raise her head at first. She only slid the folder sideways so the lawyer could read the same paragraph without her having to speak. The lawyer set his pen down on the table. He read the paragraph. He read it a second time. He looked up at Clara. His face did not change expression, but his mouth pressed thinner by a small degree. The small degree a lawyer's mouth presses when he has just recognized that the person across the table from him has already read a clause he has been quietly relying on to remain unnoticed. "Miss Hollenbeck," his voice was courteous, "may I ask when this contract was executed?" She met his eyes. "The date is in front of you. 63 days before the mortgage acceleration letter was filed against my father's property. The crop currently in the ground on the mortgaged acreage is classified for USDA compliance purposes as a canopy pollinator crop under the same subsection referenced in the contract you have in your hand. That classification is an approved dual-use classification. It is not a violation of paragraph 7 of my father's mortgage. It is a specific carve-out written into that paragraph by the bank's own compliance department in 2019. I have the drafting history in the folder underneath. She reached across without dropping his eyes and lifted the top contract off the fifth folder. Underneath it was a photocopied excerpt of the bank's own paragraph, 7 drafting notes, a public document she had obtained through a records request from the state banking division in June. The exception clause was highlighted in yellow. It named the same USDA subsection. The lawyer did not touch the photocopy. He did not need to. There is a second contract behind that photocopy, a pricing schedule for the fall delivery. Please take a look at the volume commitment and the price per hundredweight. Marlene turned to it. She read it. Something in her shoulders went still. The number on the pricing schedule was more than twice the going rate for commodity soybeans that season priced against the same acreage the bank had accelerated the loan against. Marlene read the number twice. She lifted her eyes. She looked at Clara. "Miss Hollenbeck, where did you find this cooperative?" Clara did not smile. "I found it in February, on a Sunday. I told my father I was going to a farm equipment auction. I drove north through a snowstorm to a small warehouse in a town of about 700 people. I had a 2-hour conversation with a man who had been pressing organic sunflower oil for the specialty grocery trade for 11 years and who was looking for a supplier within a truckable radius who could deliver on volume this fall. I signed the letter of intent that afternoon. I countersigned the final contract in March." Marlene's eyes did not leave hers. "Why did you not disclose this in my office in July?" Clara held her gaze. "Because you and I both know I was not asked a single question in your office in July that would have required me to disclose it. Because a woman who volunteers a card she has not been asked to lay down is a woman who has already begun to negotiate against herself." She paused. "And because I wanted to know first whether the letter you sent me was procedure or whether it was arranged." Marlene did not answer that. She did not need to. Her silence was the answer. The lawyer closed the folder gently. He set it back on the table. He did not slide it back toward Clara. He left it in the middle. "Miss Hollenbeck, I believe we will be recommending to the bank that the acceleration be withdrawn and that the loan be reinstated on its original terms." He looked at Marlene. Marlene nodded once. "Assuming the lawyer continued that you are prepared to sign an amended acreage declaration this afternoon that reflects the canopy pollinator classification and that the proceeds of the fall delivery are directed as a matter of course to the payoff of the balloon at maturity?" Clara nodded. "Draft it now. I will sign it before you leave this room." The lawyer opened his briefcase. He pulled out a legal pad. He began writing. Clara did not look at her father the whole time the lawyer was writing. She did not need to. She could feel his shoulders beside her the way a person feels the weight of a hand that has been left on hers for the length of one long breath. Then 2. She only kept her hands flat on either side of the fifth folder, and she waited. And when the lawyer finished writing, she read every line of the amendment slowly, and when she was satisfied, she signed it, and Marlene countersigned it, and the lawyer notarized it with a stamp he carried in a small leather sleeve inside his briefcase, and by 25 minutes past 3, the two of them were back in the dark sedan, driving away down the gravel drive, and the amended acreage declaration was folded on the kitchen table between Clara and Walter, and neither of them said a word for a long time. Walter reached over. He put his hand on top of hers again. He left it there longer this time. When he lifted his hand, he stood, and he walked to the porch, and he stood on the porch alone for the better part of half an hour, watching the sun move toward the west line, and Clara did not follow him. She understood by then that some things a man his age needed to work out with the porch in the sky and no company at all. The harvest came the last week of September. The county custom operator, a man named Roy Kepler, who ran 2 combines out of a shop east of town, arrived on a Tuesday morning at 7 with the larger of his 2 machines on a lowboy trailer. He unloaded it in the yard. He walked the 20-acre soybean field first, as he always did, with any new operator taking his time along the outside row, checking the standing crop against what he had been told to expect. He came back to the truck 20 minutes later with a look on his face Clara did not immediately have a name for. He shook her hand. He tipped his cap to Walter. He climbed into the cab of the combine. He started the engine. He rolled the machine into the first pass along the east headland at 7:30, and the yield monitor screen inside the cab began to fill with numbers within the first 8 minutes. Roy stopped the combine at the end of the first pass. He climbed down from the cab. He walked around to the front of the machine. He climbed back up. He read the screen. He shut the combine down. He got out again. He came across the field on foot to where Clara was standing at the truck. His face was not the face of a man who had brought bad news. His face was the face of a man who had been running combines through Iowa fields for 28 years and had just been asked by his own equipment to believe a number he did not yet know how to believe. Miss Hollenbeck, his voice was careful. I want you to come look at this yield monitor with me. I want you to look at it because I have already looked at it twice and I do not want the responsibility of being the only one who has. Clara walked out with him. She climbed into the cab. She looked at the screen. She read the number. She read it a second time. She had spent 2 years working toward a number in a range she had memorized on a legal pad. The number on the screen was above the top of her range by a full 7 bushels an acre. She climbed back down. She did not celebrate. She only nodded at Roy. Run it. He looked at her a moment more. Then he climbed back up. He started the combine. He kept running. By the middle of the afternoon on the second day, the number was no longer a private matter between Clara and Roy Kepler. Word of yields at that scale did not stay inside one cab, in a county where combine operators talked to each other 3 times a day on Channel 9. By the second evening, the extension office in town had confirmed on the strength of the yield monitor logs Roy provided to them, without Clara asking him to, that the field had produced the highest per-acre soybean yield in the recorded history of the county. It had broken the standing mark set in 1994 by a man named Everett Sorensen on his own 80 acres 2 miles east, a mark that had stood for a full generation, a mark that Hank Sorensen, his son, had never once let a soul in Marlene's diner forget. On the morning of the third day, Hank Sorensen drove out to the Hollenbeck farm without calling first. He parked at the yard. He walked to the field. He stopped at the edge of the row where Clara was leaning on the tailgate of her truck, watching the combine make its last pass along the west headland. He stood beside her a long moment without saying anything. He watched the machine finish the pass. He watched it turn. He watched it start the return. He took his cap off. He held it in both hands in front of him. My father set that number in 1994 on ground my grandfather bought in 1951. My father was a hard man. I've spent 30 years trying to be as good a farmer as he was. His voice went quieter than it had been. I owe you an apology, Miss Hollenbeck. I've owed you one since about the first week of July, and it took me until this morning to admit it to myself out loud. Clara looked at him. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She only met his eyes across the tailgate. It's not really about the flowers, Hank. It's about paying attention to what's already trying to help you and giving it a reason to stay. He put his cap back on. He nodded once. He walked back to his truck. He drove home the long way on the county road along the low bottomland, past the small white church, and when he got home, he sat in his kitchen for a long time without turning on the light, and he thought about his father, and he thought about the ways a man his age was allowed once or twice in a life to be changed by another person's harvest. Wade Corbin was seen in the county 2 more times that fall, once at a coffee shop in Grange County, having a short, quiet conversation with a lawyer Clara did not recognize. Once at a real estate office off the highway near the interstate. After the second sighting, he was not seen again. Nora Whitcomb heard through a woman she knew at the county recorder's office in October that the parent company he had represented, Midwest Agri-Holdings, had withdrawn its regional office from Des Moines by the end of the month and had not filed any further land offers in the county under that name or under 2 other names. People at the recorder's office had begun to recognize as related. Clara did not celebrate that either. She only put a small penciled note in the margin of her canvas notebook on the last page of the summer's field logs. 3 words in her own careful hand, and she closed the cover and she put the notebook on the top shelf of her closet beside the ones from previous years. Because that was where the finished ones went, and because a book was finished when the season it belonged to was finished and not before. Elias Thornberry drove out from 2 counties over on the second Saturday in October. He was 75 years old. He should not have been driving that far by himself anymore. He came anyway. He drove up the gravel drive at 10 o'clock in the morning in a small tan sedan he had kept alive by mail-order parts and stubbornness. He got out slowly at the yard. He wore the same brown corduroy jacket Clara remembered from every one of his lectures, the elbows worn through to the lining, the collar softened by decades of the same careful hands laying it flat every morning. He walked out with her to the 20-acre field. She had left the last 2 rows of soybeans standing at his request, The request phoned in the previous Tuesday so he could walk between them himself and see the pod set with his own eyes. He walked into the row. He stopped. He crouched. He pulled a single stalk gently downward with the tips of his fingers. He looked at it a long moment without speaking. Then he let it go. He straightened. He turned to Clara. "You did more with this than most of my students ever did." His voice was quiet the way it had always been in the classroom. "You didn't just learn it. You trusted it long enough to prove it." She did not answer at first. She looked out across the field toward the North 80, where the sunflower ground had already been shredded and disked. In preparation for winter, the stubble worked back into the loam, the soil dark and settling under the October light. Not everyone would have. He watched her a moment. "Most people can't, Miss Hollenbeck." He paused. "Which is why the ones who can are the only ones who move any of this forward." He said nothing else. He walked with her back to the yard. He shook her hand at the door of his sedan. He drove out of the drive at a slow, careful pace and turned east toward home. Clara stood at the mailbox until his taillights disappeared over the small rise a mile south. The rise her father's red Chevrolet had crested 9 weeks earlier at 9:15 in the morning, the last time she had ever stood in the middle of Route 9 without a plan. The balloon payment was wired to First Farmers Bank of Grange County on the 15th of November, 16 days before the maturity date. The proceeds of the Minnesota cooperative contract covered 83% of the principal balance. The proceeds of the soybean harvest covered the remainder along with the seed costs for the following spring and the property tax for the current year. Marlene Voss called the house at 3:40 in the afternoon on the day the wire cleared. She did not ask for Clara. She asked for Walter. Walter took the call at the wall phone in the hallway. He listened. He said thank you. He hung up the phone. He stood a long moment in the hallway with his hand still on the receiver. Clara came out of the kitchen. He looked at her. Cleared. She nodded once. He looked at her another long moment. His mouth worked. He did not speak. He walked past her into the kitchen. He sat down at the table. He put his forehead down on his crossed forearms. He stayed that way for the better part of a minute. Clara did not go to him. She did not touch his shoulder. She only stood in the doorway and she waited. And when he lifted his head, his eyes were dry, and he looked at her across the room, and he nodded once. That was all that passed between them. That was all that needed to. Winter came. The ground froze hard by the second week of December. The house filled with the smell of wood smoke from the stove in the front room. Walter began for the first time in as long as Clara could remember to sit with her at the kitchen table in the evenings, while she worked at her notebook, not saying much, only reading the paperback he was working through. Drinking his second cup of coffee, occasionally asking her a question about a chart or a bloom time projection that he had never before asked. She answered every one of them. She did not explain more than she was asked. She had learned by now that a man his age needed to arrive at things at his own pace, and that the greatest kindness a daughter could offer him was to leave the room he needed to arrive in unlocked without leading him to it. By the following spring, 3 neighboring farms had planted their own pollinator strips. 2 of them borrowed her bloom time charts directly. Silas Boone's phone rang almost every day that April, with calls from other producers asking about hive placement, and Silas answered every call the same way, with the low, easy patience of a man who had learned that year to trust something he had almost walked away from. Hank Sorensen came out to the Hollenbeck place on a Saturday in early May with a small crop planting binder under his arm and a shy, uncertain look on his face, and he asked Clara without preamble if she would look at a proposed layout for a 10-acre strip along the north end of his own ground. She said yes. She sat with him at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Walter poured coffee. Walter did not say much. Walter listened. The sunflowers went back into the ground the second week of May on a different quarter of the farm, this time rotated according to the calculations Clara had spent the winter working out at the kitchen table. She walked her father to the field the morning they finished planting. The 2 of them stood at the edge of the ground together in the low light. He set his coffee cup down on the fence post beside her. He looked out across the freshly worked soil. He did not speak. She did not either. A small wind moved once across the empty field. Somewhere off in the shelter belt, a red-winged blackbird called. Walter picked up his coffee. He took a slow sip. He looked at his daughter sidelong, and there was something in the corner of his eye that had not been in his eye the previous spring, a quiet steadiness that had come from watching a person he loved carry a weight for 2 years without asking to be relieved of it, and having in the end been proven right for having let her. He did not tell her he loved her. He had never been a man who could. She had known for a very long time she did not need him to. He only stood beside her at the fence line in the low May light, the coffee cup steady in his hand, and he watched the sun begin to touch the first turned edges of the soil, and he stayed there beside her a long moment more. And when he finally set the empty cup back down on the fence post and turned to walk back toward the house, she stayed a little while longer at the edge of the field by herself, her canvas notebook open on her knee, the pencil moving in short, careful strokes across the page, writing down whatever the ground was telling her that morning, in her own hand, in her own small, careful letters, unhurried, alone, and finally, for the first time in 2 years, unafraid.